This week we're talking about slavery. It's one of the most difficult, but it's perhaps the most important topic that we're going to talk about this semester. Slavery is one of these issues that we really still struggle with as a nation, as a culture. It's not something that we like to talk about. Although it's been in the news lately, with the new movie 12 Years a Slave coming out, from what I understand, and I look forward to seeing it, it's one of the few films that actually tackles slavery and really exposes the violence at the heart of it all. But we really have to understand slavery in order to understand colonial America, in order to understand antebellum America. And it's interesting because the story of slavery that you're reading here in the Foner book is certainly very different from the story that you would have read 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago about slavery. Because, as we've talked about all semester long, how we interpret history, how we write history, how we learn history changes over time. Even though the history itself, the things that happen don't change, we change as a culture, and our questions change, and our priorities change, and our perspectives change. And so how we look back on history changes. One of the earliest historians of slavery, one of the sort of the titans of slavery historians back at the turn of the 20th century was a guy named U.B. Phillips, and he was a Southerner. And the histories that he wrote about the Old South and about slavery really shaped, whole generations of Americans' understanding of slavery. And in his view, in his writing, slavery was pretty much a benign institution. It was a central institution. It was fundamental. He wasn't trying to pretend that slavery didn't matter or that wasn't central to the Civil War. But the slavery that he described was a very paternalistic one. And Foner talks about this whole culture and philosophy of paternalism, where Southern slaveholders saw themselves as kind of the fathers taking care of their slaves and really assumed this noblesse obligée, this sense of responsibility for taking care of the plantation and all of the people who depended on them. And so historians like U.B. Phillips and others after him described a very paternalistic society where slaves were by and large happy because they didn't have to bear any undue responsibilities. And that was a dominant way of portraying slavery for many decades. And it wasn't until starting in the New Deal and really accelerating after World War II, where historians started to look back with a much more critical lens and started to think about slavery in very different ways and sort of painting a very different, very dark, much darker picture of slavery, and kind of emphasizing the horrific toll that it took on the slaves. And what came out of that was a very different picture, certainly, of slavery, and it was also it kind of took the slave out of the picture. And so after the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil Rights Movement, another generation of historians goes back to slavery and says, look, yes, slavery was horrific and destructive, but it didn't destroy the slave entirely. It didn't destroy black people entirely. There was slave culture that developed, and you read about it here in Foner. Foner's building on the works of those historians in the 60s and 70s who said, well, wait a minute, we don't want to just make slavery look like it was so destructive that black people had no agency, that black people had no culture, that black people had no individuality. Even within the midst of slavery. So Foner's building on these historians post-World War II, during the Civil Rights Movement, the last several decades, that seek to complicate our understanding of slavery. There are going to be three main points I want to make to you right now in this video. First of all, I want to emphasize this idea that of slavery's Renaissance or resurrection in the early 1800s. We've talked about before how during the Revolutionary War, people were kind of embarrassed by slavery. I mean, many of the Revolutionary War leaders, like Washington, Madison, and so forth, kind of understood how slavery was antithetical to this whole idea of a country based on liberty, and that it had this sense of cognitive dissonance, that something didn't quite mesh between slavery and the freedom that the Revolutionary era leaders championed. And so there was a sense that slavery was an evil that had to be tolerated for now, but that over time it would disappear. And from the perspective of tobacco planters, the Virginia planters like Jefferson, Madison, and Washington, that seemed to make sense, because even in their time, the soils were depleting. Slaves were less and less of a central part of the economy. It's still very important, but they foresaw a different future where slavery would basically just peter away, sort of the way it had in the North. But with the invention of the cotton gin, everything changes. The cotton gin makes cotton so much easier to do. It kind of breaks the bottleneck in the process of getting it from seed to product, and makes it so much more efficient. And so when these lands in the West open up in Alabama, what's now Alabama, Mississippi, East Texas, Louisiana, and so forth, they become these cotton. It becomes the cotton kingdom, and cotton really becomes the central crop of the Atlantic slave system, and supplants sugar as the dominant crop produced by slave labor. And what it does is it cements slavery in American life. And this is very different than how the Revolutionary era envisioned it. And so what happens, and Foner talks about this, is as slavery expands, as it grows, it really encompasses the whole nation. It implicates all of the nation, because so much is riding on the Southern economy, on the slave economy, because so much is riding on cotton. The textile mills of the North are driven by cotton. And so this is one of the things that historians of recent decades have really wanted to emphasize, to say that look, we in the North can't just look down our noses at these backward Southerners who have the slaves as if slavery was confined just to the South. The economic implications of slavery spread far beyond the plantation, and it encompassed the white Southerners who didn't own slaves, who were a majority. Most slave owners only had a handful of slaves, and sometimes people will say, "Well, look, most Southerners didn't own slaves. That's why the war wasn't about slavery," and so forth. But the planters, the large planters who did own 100 or more slaves, they set the tone for everything, and the cotton economy set the tone for the entire economic order in the South, and also had implications in the North. So that's one point, is that slavery booms in the early 1800s, and it implicates the entire nation. The second point I want to make that Foner highlights is that slavery is at root a system of labor. It's a system of labor based on force and violence, right? It's a way of organizing people to do the work that needs to be done in the society, right? And so it's a way to get people to produce the cotton that's going to fuel the economy. And so we always have to remember slavery as an economic system, but it's rooted in violence, right? It's rooted in force, in coercion. Nobody chooses to be a slave. You have to force people to become slaves. You have to continually remind them who is in charge, and that's why you get whole systems of discipline on a plantation. From whipping to using slave drivers, right? Slaves themselves that you empower to then beat and control the other slaves. You seek to create divisions among slaves, particularly between house slaves who are often related to the plantation family, and then the field slaves who are very different, often have a very much different complexion and a different kind of culture. You have an entire legal system set up to control slaves, right? To keep them in their place. You have overseers on the plantation. You have slave patrols. You have entire police forces that are essentially at the beck and call of plantation owners for if slaves run away. And so you can't you can't extricate the violence and the force out of that. And so, planters had this idea of paternalism. They had this idea that they were the father figure. They were the kindly gentleman who who would never think of mistreating his slaves. But at root, that paternalism was based in violence, right? Because any slave who did not toe the line, any slave who did not do what he or she was told, faced the physical consequences, the whippings, the beatings. For women, the rape. There was, and then of course, the threat of sale. And Foner emphasizes this, and it's hard to overemphasize the power that this had over people, right? The idea that at any point in time, your wife or your husband or your child or anyone close to you could be sold away. I mean, that is a powerful disincentive to doing anything against the master. So these folks who try to pretend that oh, slaves were happy, they did, they sang and danced and so forth, they're completely ignoring the whole idea, the whole violence that's at the root of slavery. And the third point I want to emphasize that's coming out of Foner is that despite the hardships of slavery, the slaves develop this resilient culture, right? That the family becomes tremendously important. Not just the nuclear family, but the extended family, multiple generations. And this has, the roots of slavery extend far beyond the Civil War and emancipation. This idea of multi-generational families being very important. This idea that both family and religion form the bedrocks of slave culture is something that's going to go on well into the 20th and 21st centuries. And how they reshape, during the 1800s, this is when slaves, by and large, become American, because the African slave trade is over. The internal or domestic slave trade has begun, but the American slave population is reproducing itself. So you have more and more American-born slaves who know English as their first language, who become Christian. But that doesn't mean that they just follow or mimic the master's culture, right? They reshape the culture. And Foner does a good job of showing how they do that with the Bible, right? And Exodus. So, the masters want to use Christianity to kind of have the slaves obey their masters, and the slaves are saying, no, look, Exodus, that's our story, right? This is a story of liberation. They identify with the Israelites fleeing from Pharaoh, and so they're constantly reshaping the master's culture to their own ends. And the other point is to talk about resistance, and this is one of the hardest things for modern day people to understand. When I used to teach about slavery in Mississippi to black students in Mississippi, many of my younger students would say, well, I would never have taken that. I would never have let them whip me or let them treat me like a slave. I would have fought back. And the truth of the matter is, it was very, very difficult to fight back. There are few examples of American slaves successfully fighting back. The odds were simply too great. The odds against them were too large because they were generally outnumbered, if not in the local community, then at large in the state or in the nation. And the consequences were dire. Even running away could bring harsh consequences to the rest of your family. So there were so many things that masters had, so many levers of power that masters had. It was very, very difficult for slaves to overtly resist. But that doesn't mean they didn't resist. Right? Foner talks about all the different ways that slaves resisted. You got to remember that even if it doesn't come outright, even if it's not shown outright, slaves are resisting constantly. The question I want you to answer for this week, for your extra credit question, is I want you to choose an image. Take an image. There's a lot of compelling images in here. Describe it in detail. Explain what it shows about American slavery, and describe your own reaction to that image. See you in class.